The Pastimes is brought to you by Prairie Knights Casino and Resort.
Feeding and supplying the Frontier Army. This is The Pastimes, your news from the edge of history. For U.S. Army posts to exist on the frontier, it was utterly impossible without a consistent flow of supplies and equipment. With the numerous frontier posts that span the Great Plains, one has to wonder, how do these remote Army posts get resupplied, and where does it all come from? The objective of each post dictated what supplies were required. For example, a cavalry post would need different supplies and equipment than an infantry post. Whatever the necessities were, the QMD or the quartermaster department for each territory had a daunting task to keep animals and men outfitted and fed. Each Army post had a quartermaster sergeant who maintained the lifeblood of supplies and equipment to operate a post, from something as simple as a servant or striker making a cup of tea for an officer to something as complex as outfitting an entire regiment for any number of campaigns or expeditions for long, extended periods of time. As a result, the exorbitant amount of supplies and equipment a Frontier Army post went through was phenomenal. Each Army post was assigned to an area, territory, or designated by the U.S. Army as a department, and each department had a series of depots scattered throughout the West. One depot might be designated specifically for ordnance, while another was for grain, commissary stores, and building materials. Knowing what supplies and equipment a frontier post needed was one thing, but getting them to the post was entirely another task. For example, Fort Abraham Lincoln's supplies came by rail and steamboat to Bismarck. Fort Lincoln could not possibly rely on Bismarck's meager supply system of general and grocery stores to sustain a major operation the 7th Cavalry needed. The Quartermaster Department produced all transportation contracts through civilian sources. Gone were the days of military trains used quite extensively during the Civil War, but civilian contractors were by far more economical. In 1865, shortly after the Civil War, costs for transporting supplies through Utah and New Mexico by rail was well over $6 million. Costs were reduced significantly from 1867 through 1870 with the advent of the westward advancing Northern Pacific and Union Pacific railroads. Wagon transportation was still a reality to far-flung posts in the Southwest, such as Arizona. As an example of the extreme costs of wagon transportation, a typical barrel of flour shipped from San Francisco for $5 was worth $25 by the time it actually reached posts in Arizona. To feed or supply a single soldier in the area of Arizona was at least 5 times more. Before the Western Railroad system really got underway, steamboats were used extensively to transport military stores to frontier Army posts. Missouri River posts such as Fort Buford, Fort Abraham Lincoln, Fort Rice, and Fort Randall would be supplied and resupplied by steamboat on a regular basis. Supplying and resupplying frontier Army posts was advantageous for the local civilian populace because it boosted the job market as long as the frontier post was in operation. Since the Frontier Army's mule, horses, and personnel needed to eat, farmers and ranchers would provide grain and cattle. Fort Abraham Lincoln, as an example, had a contracted herd of 100 beef cattle, which was used on post and especially off post during long and arduous campaigns that required fresh beef. Mules were sometimes provided to pull freight wagons, cannon limbers, and Gatling gun limbers. The mules were used extensively during campaigns to haul supplies and equipment. Elizabeth Custer writes in her book, Tenting on the Plains, the most spirited mules are selected from the train 4 leaders. Something that has not changed between civilians and military authorities is supply and demand economics. Many times supply markets would be created and thrive based solely on the fact that hostile Indian activity was present. It has been said that many years later that war produces economic prosperity. The daily life of a frontier soldier, United States Indian scout, laundress, or military spouse depended largely on good supplies and, more importantly, good food to exist on the frontier. Food at frontier posts was, to say the least, less than desirable. It usually consisted of beef or pork, bread, vegetables, if available, rice, beans, and lots of strong coffee. In 1867, at Forts Wallace and Hayes, Mrs. General Custer related her opinion of the state of Army food and how it was stored from her book, Tenting on the Plains. None of the posts at the time were provided with decent food beyond the railroad. The bacon issued to the soldiers was not only rancid, but was supplied by dishonest contractors who slipped in any foreign substance they could to make the weight come up to the required amount, and thus the soldiers were cheated out of the quantity due them. I saw a flat stone sandwiched between the layers of bacon as they were packed together. Flour and bacon were only protected by tarpaulins. Both became rancid and moldy and were at the mercy of the rats and mice. Within each company barracks is the kitchen and the mess hall. This is the Army cook's domain for at least a month at a time. Then another cook would be assigned. Whether the cook was responsible for an enlisted family or an officer and his family, each Army cook had his own individual skills depending on what food supplies were available. Basically, the Army had three kinds of cooks on a typical Army post. The first Army cook is the company cook. This cook may have any number of assistants detailed to him. The cooks come out of the company ranks and are not by any means trained or professional cooks, so the men are at the mercy of these amateur cooks to get fed 3 times a day. Soups, stews, beef, hash, salted pork, or salted beef were the usual fare on the enlisted daily menu. Each company maintains a vegetable garden to augment their diet. At Fort Abraham Lincoln, the enlisted personnel would have competitions to see who could grow the largest and the best vegetables. Catfish and other wild game were provided, but rarely was served to the men on a regular basis. Regardless of what kind of food was provided, Army regulations still had to regulate much of the food to each company. Enlisted wives are also classified as a type of cook on the post, and a married soldier, as a rule, always eats better than the bachelor soldiers. However, enlisted wives are still subjected to rationing and the ever-present regulations that govern them. The third and last type of cook belonged to the officer. Rations also applied to officers, but they were entitled to more of them. Officers had the privilege of partaking in the local bounty of wild game provided by themselves or the post scouts. In a larger sense, food and equipment supplied to all soldiers not only contributed to their morale and welfare, but, in the end, their quality of performance, maintenance of good health standards, and their psychological well-being.